Hello, and welcome to episode 130 of the Book Binge. This is just a quick introduction, very short before we get into the discussion of the video. If you saw the thumbnail and the title and you clicked on this video, obviously you know I am doing a conversation with Philip Chase, Dr. Fantasy himself, not just about the Edan Trilogy, but also about a lot more than that as well. But if you don't know who Philip Chase is, he is a college professor who teaches English courses and also has a fantasy literature course as well. He has a booktube channel that I've linked in the description at Philip Chase the Best of Fantasy. Yes, that whole tag is his channel. That surely the majority of you watching this probably know about. If you're watching this, you probably already have watched his channel before. He has acquired the name Dr. Fantasy because of his professions and his knowledge and experience with the fantasy genre, broadly speaking, just a general expertise, so to speak. More recently, in 2023, he published all 3 books of the Edan Trilogy, all of which I read that year, and of which we will be discussing in the next portion of this video. Dr. Fantasy graciously accepted my request for an audience with him and my offer for an appearance on the channel to discuss the books. There will be a spoiler-free discussion to start, so basically everything up until I give the warning of a spoiler section in the middle of that discussion is free game for anybody, even if you have not read the books. We don't discuss any spoilers for the Edan books. Then, when I give the warning that there's a spoiler section, we will be talking about spoilers of all 3 Edan books in a little bit deeper of a manner, but be warned, it's not like we go into spoilers for each individual book. I basically dive in the spoiler section right into a question that goes into the very end of the series, like the 3rd book. So if you have not read the whole trilogy, I advise that you watch up until that point, but then you can skip until the end, where there will be a little bit more of a miscellaneous section where we go off track and talk about a few other things that aren't really Edan related, so you can watch those sections as well. But without much further ado, I hope you enjoy my discussion with Dr. Philip Chase. Say hello to the channel, Dr. Philip Chase.
Oh, hello.
Just
Great to
kind of
be here.
Yeah, just kind of jumping right into things. This is our first time talking face to face, sort of. Haven't had a whole
Yes.
lot of discussion outside of that, actually. I just kind of wanted to jump into things and start off with my first question being related to the Dr. Philip Chase side of things. I read that you actually proposed the idea for the fantasy course that you teach. For those who may not know, Philip actually teaches a fantasy course at the university or the college that you teach at. Were you actually the one that proposed that course?
This is true. Yes, I created a fantasy novels course at my college. Yes. And has been a lot of fun to teach. Yeah.
How did that come about? When did this actually happen? I'm really curious to know the timeline of that.
Well, I would say it was at least a decade ago, probably more than a decade ago. And I had been teaching long enough, and my chairperson at the time, who's retired now, she thought it would be a good idea to create something new and interesting for the students. And a lot of students are interested in fantasy, and it's actually pretty popular genre, and it always
Right.
has struck me as evident that there's a lot of books in the fantasy genre that are worthy of critical exploration, and that's what I wanted to do in the course. That's the reason I started a YouTube channel as well.
Right.
So that's what I did. Yeah, I created a course, and I change up over the years. I change up which books we read, but we read the texts, and we have great classroom discussions. Some of the best classroom discussions I've ever had are around fantasy novels, not just because people are excited to read fantasy, but also because there's a lot there. I mean, I think fantasy has a lot in common with myth, and myth is
Right.
around for a reason. It speaks to some very deep human psychological needs and experiences, and I think that there are very few genres that embrace that role of storytelling the way fantasy does. So it's great classroom literature.
I can imagine that that would be the case as well, because not only is fantasy often based on myth, but certain authors create a mythos that fans often get very, very into. I mean, Tolkien is the
Sure.
prime example of a very
Yeah.
deep, intense mythos and lore associated with the world. So I can imagine that that would be the case. How often do you have people enter your class who aren't necessarily super like active readers in the first place? Because I can imagine most people who would enter a course like that would be people who just already love to read. How often is that not the case?
I do get some, used to get more, like business majors or nursing majors who aren't necessarily readers, but they need a humanities course and it looked like something tolerable maybe.
Oh, right,
So,
right.
yeah.
Oh, it's just
So
reading
that does
books. How
happen.
hard can it be?
Right, right. Yeah. So, but I think the thing about teaching is it's very easy to teach students who are super motivated and want to be there. It's a joy to have students like that, of course. But I feel like the real art of teaching comes into play when you have students who are not necessarily excited about being there or who are underprepared. So that's when you really know how good you are at teaching, when you have students
Right.
who aren't as invested. And if you can create the best feeling in the world, the best feeling in the world is when you can create or help to foster some enthusiasm. And my favorite days teaching are when a student will say to me, I used to hate English class, and now I think I want to take another course in this because this is kind of cool, and not just like, wow, you just made my year. Thank you very much.
Right.
So
I actually kind of liken that a little bit to even, my experience as a reader. Some of the most influential reads are the ones that maybe kind of pushing the boundaries of what you're familiar with, or especially what you're comfortable with. And then once you push that, if it happens to be rewarding in a really impactful way that can entirely change the landscape of how you view not just like a genre or an author, but like an entire sphere of literature.
yeah,
I
yeah,
personally feel this way the most with like classics literary fiction, just because they're not really technically a genre in the proper sense that we think about it, because you can have so much different stuff that fits there. But I can imagine that that would be the case.
yeah, yeah,
How
for sure.
has teaching English and fantasy shifted and improved your own reading and writing experiences, respectively?
Oh yeah, I mean, consider myself a student of the genre, and there is no better way to learn something than to have to teach it. So
I've heard
that
that
has
one
been,
before.
yeah, I'm sure you have, and it is true. The fact is, I think that I learned a lot over the years from teaching, and I had actually started to write before I created that fantasy novels course, but I'm sure in the process of revising, I incorporated some of what I was picking up from the novels that I was teaching and the techniques I was seeing in them and that sort of thing. So I think it was very helpful. Yeah, I mean, as you know very well, because you write yourself, I think it's very important for us to read, 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 and not only in our genre but outside as well.
Yes, yes, I agree.
Yes.
Some of my most, some of my biggest influences in writing actually aren't even within fantasy specifically. A lot of it actually comes from the actual writing, the prose generally, of a lot of older, generally more sophisticated writers, as pretentious as
Uh,
that probably sounds, but reading classics and literary fiction again has been a huge, huge thing as a reader,
yeah,
to
I
affect
wish
me
there
as a
was more.
writer.
Yeah, that's great, I think. I mean, one of my favorite authors, Steven Erikson, is well known for basically using techniques that are common in what people call literary fiction,
As broad as
and
a
not
genre
maybe.
that can be.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a useless designation, but I think people kind of know what it is when they see it,
Yeah.
I guess. Um, but these are techniques that are common and there, but maybe not so common in fantasy. And why not? Why not use those techniques in fantasy? So yeah, I believe that that's very important and essential to actually learn as much as you can from various modes and genres and nonfiction as well. You know, that'll enrich your fiction writing a lot.
Right, right. I have a little bit less experience with nonfiction at this point. Most of the nonfiction I've read is biographical in nature, but in a sense, that's
Mhm.
actually really good because biographical stuff can be a huge insight into how to write character or
Very
how to
useful. Yeah,
interpret character, even just reading. Uh, that
very
that's
useful.
something I've come across anyway. But you did
Yeah.
mention you had started writing a little bit before you actually started doing the fantasy course, and you've mentioned you started a Dan 18 plus years ago. When and
Yeah.
how did that process actually start with a Dan? Was it like a lightning strike moment of like I have this idea, or how did things develop? Because that is a pretty long road to travel with the work.
Yeah, well, in many ways, it's even longer because I knew I wanted to write fantasy when I was as young as 12 or 13 years old after reading Lord of the Rings and experiencing what I would now call catharsis. You know, 12-year-old me did not know that word, but
Oh,
I
right.
experienced what you could call catharsis, and I thought to myself, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to do that. You know, if I can do this for what Tolkien did for me at the end of Return of the King, if I could do that for some other person, then yes, that's what I want to try to do. And so I had decided that, but shortly after resolving that I wanted to be a writer, I had the opportunity to meet one in in eighth grade. Our school in rural Vermont had this day when we would go meet writers, or not writers, but someone in a career that we were interested in. So if you said, "I
Okay.
want to be a police officer," they'd put you in the police station for a day, you know. Or if I want to be a doctor, you'd get to go to the hospital and whatever, you know. I said I want to be a writer, and they had to find a writer for me in rural Vermont, and they found this really great guy named David Budbill, who I actually knew him as a playwright, but he has written novels and he wrote poems. He's passed away since, but he was very gracious, and he met with me, and we had a great conversation. He was happy to talk to me and said, "Hey, it's great that you want to be a writer, but you're going to need a day job, probably, unless you have some, you know, means of other means of support or someone who will, you know, support you." So I thought about what am I going to do that's what I had to figure out. What am I going to do for a day job? And ultimately fell into academia, became a medievalist, probably trying to follow in Tolkien's footsteps, you know, learning old languages, Old English, Old Norse, and many other languages, you know, I had to have some means of supporting myself and a family, as it turned out. So I went into that, and that was years, of course, of, you know, writing a dissertation, and all the time I was doing this, I was thinking, I'm gonna someday do my creative writing. I'm gonna, you know, all this stuff I'm doing, all this medieval studies and everything. Hopefully, I'll be able to use that in my fiction someday. And so all that happened until I got a job after finishing my PhD, and that was in 2002. And then 2 years into that job, because it really was a lot to adjust to this big job. So it took me 2 years to say, all right, I'm ready. And in 2004, I started writing. And I began by drawing a map and writing a whole history of the world that I was going to put the story in. And so I did a lot of world building first. And then I just started, boom. And I had a pretty finished draft of what's now books one and two by 2007. And
Okay, so probably
I,
around 3 years or so.
yeah, took me about 3 years to write. It was one book, but I kept tweaking it and working on it, and then was able to get an agent behind me because I thought I was going to do traditional publishing. That was the route I thought I was going to do. And the agent came on board at the very end of 2011, and said to me, "Hey, this is great, but this is not one book; it's two books." And I said, "Okay." And so I worked with him and worked with him, and it was a really great process because he's an excellent agent. The really great agents will work with you to try to help you make your book better. You know,
Right,
like an editor,
right.
almost like a developmental editor. So we did that and did that and did that, and you know, and in the process, he pitched the books a couple times, no takers. And in retrospect, really, I can say there probably never would have been, because what I was writing is not really what traditional publishers are looking for these days. They're
Yeah, I
not
would agree with
so
that.
interested in kind of classically inspired fantasy, European medieval kind of inspirations. They're really looking for something different these days. So I was probably doomed from the start in terms of finding a traditional publisher, which worked out fine. I am absolutely happy with the way things have worked out, because self-publishing has become such a viable route now, and you can get everything that a traditional publisher can do for you, as a self-published author these days. There are great developmental editors that you can hire. There are wonderful artists, cover designers, you name it. You can get all the services that a traditional publisher would have provided in the past. But you have to pay for it, of course, unless
Right,
you're willing to
right.
do it yourself. So
A
yeah,
little
I
bit
think
of
it
a
worked out
bigger
great.
upfront cost as the author, but
That's right.
it kind of
But
comes
you
with the
also get
territory at that point. You get more control.
absolutely more control, more creative freedom. I was able to put out 3 books in 1 year. No traditional publisher ever would have allowed me to do that.
Especially not for
So
epic fantasy.
no, no, yeah,
Like
there's no
maybe for
way.
urban fantasy or something, you can do 2 a year depending on what you're kind of
Yeah,
doing, but
yeah,
even that kind of depends.
yeah. So I had a lot of control. Of course, I wouldn't recommend doing it without lots of feedback. And nobody's going to write a perfect book. And the more feedback and the more professional feedback you can get, the better. I have a great developmental editor. He has a YouTube channel as well, A Critical Dragon.
Is that AP? Yeah.
Brilliant guy. AP Canavan, yeah, brilliant fellow who also. There are 2 people who really. I got a lot of feedback on these books, but there were 2 people who were really professional, who really helped me to improve them. And one was that agent that I talked about, and the other is AP Canavan. And
Okay.
their feedback, yeah, just really, really vital, I think. So yeah, that was kind of the process. It boiled down a lot. That's the quick version. Yeah.
Okay, that's actually really interesting. I kind of want to circle back a little bit to what you were saying a little bit earlier in there, that you basically had essentially a finished draft of what was the first 2 books by 2007 or so. Uh,
Yep.
I find this really interesting because I remember noting in my both my written and my video reviews for The Prophet of Edan, which is the second book in the trilogy, that felt like where the climax of a traditional
Uh-huh.
trilogy or a normal what you would expect from a story would have been. That's what it was building towards from the
Yep.
beginning, or at least that's what it
Yep.
felt like. How, or rather, when did you start to include the material for Return to Edan? I remember you talking about this once or twice on your channel, but I forget the details actually.
Sure. Yeah, so I did the first 2, and then worked with the agent to make them 2 books out of one, essentially. And I was in my 30s during most of that, and then I can't remember the exact year I started to write the 3rd book, but I had started to read a lot of more fantasy. I had read quite a bit uh, when I wrote the first, what would become the first 2 books. I had read a fair amount, but I wanted to read more. I wanted to find out what people were reading these days, because I'd read a lot of older fantasy. So a
Right.
lot of my big inspirations were older writers like Tolkien and Ursula Le Guin, and I felt like maybe I should kind of catch up with the times, because I'm a medievalist. A lot of, aside from those older fantasy writers, much of my inspiration is like from Beowulf and the old Norse sagas and stuff like that. So it really goes way back. So I thought maybe I should figure out what's going on in the genre today. And so I did searches like, best fantasy. What are people reading? And I wanted to find out. And of course, one of those I had already read before writing my books was George R. R. Martin, A Song of Ice and Fire, and so I can't that I can say is probably an important influence on my writing as well. in addition to those much older writers. But yeah, I started reading other things like Abercrombie's, first law books, and I read Mark Lawrence, and started to read some Robin Hobb, and started to read other authors that are now favorites of mine.
Right.
And Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson. And I would say of all those, probably Malazan Book of the Fallen had the most impact on me. And I feel like my third book is the way it is because I wrote it after I read Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's not exactly like Malazan by any
Right.
means, but what I've told people, including Stephen Erickson, actually, is reading Malazan Book of the Fallen liberated my imagination and
That checks
helped
out
me to
with what
see,
I've heard of
okay,
the series.
yeah, yeah, it was like, wow, okay, fantasy can do this too. All right, let's do this, and I felt like I really let it go in the third book. I felt like I was forging a path of my own in that third book. That it still very much springs from the first two, but I feel like I was probably doing something very different in that third book. At least that's how I felt when I was writing it, and I think the response to it would probably confirm that. So
Personally, at least, I feel like I can confirm that primarily because as I went on, I noted The Way of Edan, the first book, being very classically inspired with like some modern, ideation towards it, but overall
yeah.
feeling, especially in the writing, the prose feels very classic fantasy in that one. And it's part
Mhm.
of why I loved the atmosphere of it so much. But then The Prophet of Edan was a lot different. I didn't feel like that one felt as classic fantasy as the first one did. It still kind of had a little bit of that, but not quite. I would say Return to Edan, I never felt like I was reading a classic fantasy book at that point. So in that way, I feel like the trilogy was almost a bridge from the more classically inspired to a more modern take on the story while also letting the story
Uh,
be what it is. I don't know if that made sense, but
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, yeah,
but I guess that
yeah,
checks
for
out
sure.
with kind of the way that you were writing it too. So that's interesting to note.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be the first author to do something like that. I think some people say the same of Wheel of Time, for example, that it starts out feeling very classical fantasy. The first book is actually pretty closely modeled on Lord of the Rings. And then later, Robert Jordan all goes off on his own. And of course, Brandon Sanderson wrote the last three books in that series. Um, but the series gets a lot darker and does its own thing. I think it's fair to say by the second, third book, So,
I would agree with
but
that. I've
yeah,
only read the first four books in Wheel of Time so far. And
uh-huh.
actually, the Fellowship of the Ring comparisons for Eye of the World, I've actually found to be largely overstated. Or
You think? Okay,
yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah.
find the people who claim that it is a Fellowship of the Ring clone to be uh, being
That's a slight exaggeration.
overcritical. Yeah, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, and I have one particular friend who was actually making it out to be like the entire first half of the book is exactly beat by beat the same, and I'm like, no, it's not. But that was just my take of that. But I can agree as the next few books kind of went on, it has grown into its world, which is one of
Yeah.
Jordan's strengths. I would agree.
Oh yeah, that world that he portrays in there is quite amazing. I mean, talk about world building. My goodness, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The lore, especially, is one of my favorite parts. And actually, that kind of goes into a question that I didn't have written on here, but I do want to ask. Uh, Aside from, having your classic, like, myth based world building and building this off of, like, Beowulf and old European legend and even more classic fantasy, what maybe were some of the more specific aspects of the world building? Where did some of those come from, if you don't mind being able to do that, like
Yeah.
different regions of the world, so to speak. Because for me as a reader, I found this world, Jormungand, and the map of it especially to be like very immersive. The first book, I was able to follow every location, and I just really loved following that. And I found
Good.
that to also be true in the third book, just being able to follow each location separately. So what was that world building experience like for the separate regions of it? Because it is very distinct
Yeah.
between different areas.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I think Jack Shepard did a wonderful job on the map. He also did my cover design, so he did a fantastic job. If you ever need a map, he's the guy.
I'll probably end up asking someone because the one that I'm developing is not good.
Oh yeah, I mean, I had hand drawn mine, and I am so glad that I paid someone who was a professional to make it look really nice, and I couldn't be happier with the way Jack did that work. So, but yeah, in terms of the world building, I based the cultures and the place names of each of the regions on real world cultures that I'm familiar with. The the Mark and Torland and Elland, for example, are very closely based on Old English, and the place names within there are derived straight from Old English.
That much
And
at
some of
least
them
I
are
could decipher.
yeah, some of them are little jokes of my own. Like there's a river called Ea in Torland, and Ea in Old English means river, so it's the river.
Oh yeah, I'm pretty
uh,
sure I knew that because isn't that also something referenced in Tolkien's mythology? I don't remember for sure, but I feel like I
Maybe
remember that from Silmarillion when I was starting that
it might
last year.
be,
I might be
it
making
might
that
be.
up though.
But that is something Tolkien would do, and would have been very aware of, would have seen right away, and probably would have rolled his eyes if he had seen my map and seen the river Ea. But anyway, but
Tolkien would have
yeah,
rolled
that
his
that
eyes at a
that
lot, to be fair.
probably, yeah. So the Grimrick, where Orvindil is from, the Thioths, that culture is based very closely on Old Norse. The place names there, like Mjolfelth means the Mead River, or Valfoss is the Slaughter Falls.
Oh man, that's
That's just
epic. It's very metal of
yeah,
you.
yep, yep. So that's straight out of there. The cultures of the Southwest, Adanon and Caergillion, very much based on the sounds of Welsh, which is a language I learned when I was 19 years old, and spent some time in Wales. And so it was just a lot of fun to make a culture that is more Celtic in inspiration there. And the names and the place names come from, a lot of them come straight out of Irish and Welsh. Like you'll find some of them are actually historical names. Some I just made up. Some I took from words like Seren means star in Welsh, for example. And then there's the Andumaic cultures. That would include Azralad, as well as the kingdoms off to the east. Sundara and Golgar and Sildaran. The language and the names and everything, I took the feel of those from South Asia, where I actually lived for a time. I lived in Nepal and traveled all over India, and I took a lot of what I built that culture around from my experiences traveling in that part of the world. Although I would say I mixed in a kind of a Roman Mediterranean kind of feel to it as well. So it's sort of a melange of things. But certainly the language. If you took somebody who was a Nepali or a Hindi speaker, and they would see Andumaic, and they'd say, I know what that means. Probably.
Oh
So
really?
although it's kind of yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
I actually never caught that one specifically. I would not have guessed South Asian for
Yep.
any
That's
of that.
part of it. It's part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's actually really interesting. I like hearing that because now it kind of gives me a little bit more of a basis to kind of think of some things when I eventually do a reread, because I will reread this trilogy at some point.
Oh,
And
cool.
I
Yeah.
when I do that, I want to do them closer together rather than spread out by a few months,
Uh-huh.
so I can
Oh,
catch
that's
more.
either way. Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'll
No,
I'll
that's
say
great.
that Adanon and Caragillion, I really liked those areas for some reason. I just felt
Good.
really immersed in the story specifically when they took place there. And it also stands to reason that the influence that you labeled for those being sort of Welsh and Irish,
Yep.
being strangely enough the sort of accents that I would read those characters in my head just unintentionally. I didn't even realize that that was going to be a thing. But
Yep.
I,
Yep.
I guess that makes sense. How have you felt about the reception for each individual release of the Edan trilogy? And what was it like waiting the 3 months in between each one? Like, was it, anticipation for the next book? Or were you fine in between because you were still had trickling more reviews and more thoughts to read from the previous one up until each one?
Yeah, it's a fairly unusual release schedule, I would say, and, so it didn't give me much time to feel much anxiety, honestly. It was getting the covers ready, getting the formatting, the final editing, all that stuff. So that it was a busy year, you can imagine, I'm sure. Even though I had written pretty much everything and everything was ready, I still had to do all that formatting, and that's, something I had to learn a lot of new skills to put the books out, including how to use, I used a software called Vellum to get most of the formatting done so that I could publish both the ebook and the paperback. And but I'm not a tech person, so that involved some learning for me. So
Don't
yeah,
worry,
I didn't
it
feel
would
too.
involve learning for me too, and I'm relatively
Yeah,
techy.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I there were certain tricks I had to figure out for sure, and I had help. I have to say the self-publishing fantasy community is wonderful. Several individuals helped me a lot. Von Roycroft and Thiago Abdallah and Ryan Cahill all were very generous with their time and giving me tips about vellum and other things that you need to do as a self-published author. So yeah, it was great. How to use KDP, which is the Amazon publishing platform. How to use Ingram Spark, which is an alternative publishing platform. So yeah, and why you would want to use one or the other or both. I ended up using both. But yeah, there's a lot to learn, and I that was stuff that I had to get down. And so obviously the learning curve was the biggest for The Way of Edan coming out first.
Right.
Um,
Because then you could
but
kind
I
of
still had
just
to do all of
touch
that.
up your techniques for the rest of it, speed it up a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It got a little easier with each one, but I still had to do all that formatting and final editing and everything else. So, and then of course the marketing is yeah, so that's a big thing as not just a self-publishing author actually these days, really the vast majority of traditionally published authors also have to hustle. They have to get out there on social media, they have to because the traditional publishers are really only going to back the books that they feel are going to be their leaders, their winners, and they're going to let everything else just hang out to dry, really. And so
Yeah.
it's up to you, the author, to go out and peddle your books wherever and however you can. So that marketing aspect of this has been a lot of time and a lot of learning, and some of it's fun because you get to meet people, and that's great. And you meet people with the same passions that you have, and that's wonderful. But there's just it's very time consuming. So you have to be prepared to do all that if you want to put out a book. It's not possible to just write a book in your attic and send it out to the world and think that you're going to have miraculously readers appear.
Yeah,
So
unless you're Thomas Pynchon, who's been doing that for the last 60 years, then
yeah,
yeah, that's
but he
he's
gets away with it. Yeah.
yeah, he gets away with it just because he's had that foothold. So, how did having a booktube channel uh, affect this whole process, especially where you talk about marketing? Because I can imagine marketing is a little bit easier in some sense when you already have an audience of technically several thousand people just kind of there,
Yeah.
regardless of whether they may or
Yeah.
may not be inherently interested.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly some people who know me from YouTube who probably were curious, and that was a big help. Overall, I would say it was an advantage for sure to have worked for several years to build up a YouTube channel and to have a kind of a core audience kind of there already. But I would also say that you need to be aware of some disadvantages too. One being, I got comments right away from people saying, "Oh, you're a booktuber, and therefore anything you write is garbage."
Right.
That was. I mean, you're gonna encounter people like that. Never mind the fact that I was working for 18 years and that I was a booktuber for only 3 or 4 years.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
The way things go.
but yeah, I mean, and there were people, frankly, who, for whatever reason, were unhappy with the fact that I was publishing a book and that I have a YouTube channel, and they review bombed me from the beginning. People who just on the day the book was released gave me 1-star reviews on Goodreads and said, "This guy's horrible. Don't read his books," and I'm
I
saying,
saw one
really?
review for Way of a Dan like that very early on, and I read it, and it actually turns out you cannot reply to that post. They actually have the
Yeah,
replies disabled, so you could tell where the motivation for that one was. I just thought it was more funny
yeah.
than anything, but
Yeah, I mean, there are people who are, for whatever reason, and I hope they find a more positive place to put their energy. But they want to do damage, so that's what they do, I guess. But you try not to think about stuff like that, and you just do your thing, and you keep your head down, you keep working, and hopefully the work speaks for itself, and you find people who with whom the story resonates and the word spreads, and it's just keep at it, keep at it, keep at it. And you can't do anything about people who decide that they're going to try to get in your way, especially with the anonymity of the internet.
yes, yes, comes with the territory for sure.
Yep. Yep. A lot of people hide behind that and do things they would never do in, face to face or in real life. So it's a shame because they're trying to hurt real people. They have a buffer, that
Yeah.
makes them probably less attuned to the fact that they are hurting real people. Uh, you know. So yeah, but overall, I'd say having the YouTube channel, good thing. I'm part of a community that's passionate about fantasy, and that's fantastic overall. But be aware, if you have a YouTube channel and you are a self-publishing author, you could encounter some unhappy people.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I see it, because admittedly, this actually did not motivate my desire to start BookTube at all, but I realized, like, pretty much when I made the decision I'm gonna do this, I also saw it as like, okay, well, depending on how long certain pieces of my writing take and what it
Yeah,
takes to develop those stories, also depending on how my YouTube channel does, I can use that in the future. It is a resource
yeah.
at that point, regardless of what
It is
place it's
overall.
at.
Yeah, it really is. But there will be people who want to come get you just because you have a YouTube channel. Or I had a guy who left a blatantly racist comment on one of my videos. And I don't put up with that. I just block people like that. And lo
Right.
and behold, someone with exactly the same name, the same day, gave me a 1-star review.
Oh no.
Um, you're going to encounter stuff like that.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. Taking things a bit too personally in a way.
Yeah, well, I guess he thought he was gonna try to hurt me because I wasn't gonna listen to his, hate spewing, so,
Good word. Good word. We love the $5 words here.
yeah,
But even so, I did notice, like, every time like I've reviewed one of the books, I've gone in and kind of like looked at the general ratings and scores and noticed that they're all sitting pretty good. Like even The Way of a Dan is over 4-star
yeah,
average, which for a
yeah.
debut, that's pretty decent. What's the plan for the future of Jormungand with, the trilogy now essentially done? I know you
Yeah.
said you have a standalone coming this year, maybe, if you want to expound on that.
Yeah, hopefully I'll be able to follow through with that. I have a complete draft of a standalone sequel called Wild Darkness Gathers, and it takes place 15 years or so after the trilogy concludes. And I still need to go over that draft, redo, I think, a lot of things. It's been a little while since I've revisited it. And then I would like to show it to my developmental editor, and then go over it again. And then I think I'll be ready to put it out. I was hoping maybe for August of 2024 of this year, but we'll see. I've gotten busier with, I'm a judge for SPFBO, which is the self-published fantasy blog off, the contest that Mark Lawrence started to help, shine a spotlight on self-published fantasy. And that has been a real blessing. I've loved doing that, but it has made me very busy.
Yes, I
So
can imagine. I can't read that many books in a year just straight up, let alone adding that on top of my already planned stuff.
yeah, yeah. So that's taken a big chunk of my time, and I do have commitments on YouTube as well, buddy reads and stuff that are taking me longer. It's a funny thing about life. I've been around long enough to learn the lesson that everything takes longer than I think, but I still don't learn that lesson.
I have come to
So,
realize that the last year or so as well. Every time I plan for
yep,
my schedule to go one way, it takes a little bit longer, especially writing, because that's when I started buckling down on my fantasy stuff, was this year doing that. And every time I've been like, okay, I should be able to do this by this time, and very rarely does it work out that way.
yep, yep.
Oftentimes it's my
That's
own
life.
fault, but it is still,
Yeah.
the fact of life.
Unfortunately, yes. But yeah, you just keep at it. And so I do hope I'll be able to put that out this year. Yeah.
Well, I can't wait to get a hold of it, whatever it is. Mike's book reviews, his Discord server has had the question of the day channel, and a couple of times over the last couple months, people have asked about like most anticipated reads for the year, and every one of them I put whatever Philip Chase puts out next as one of them,
Oh,
because I really like
thank
this
you.
trilogy and I can't wait to have more of the world, because it just really worked.
Cool. I'm glad. And I think, I hope that the sequel will follow organically from the trilogy. In other words, you will see changes uh, from those 15 years that have gone by that will, I hope, make sense considering what happened at the end of the trilogy.
Yeah, it was a big moment. It hit me. I'll
Yeah.
I'll tell you what. But with that being said, I suppose this is a pretty decent time to move into the spoiler-filled section. So if anybody
Okay.
watching this has not read the trilogy or has not finished the trilogy, it is probably safe to click off here, or if there's a timestamp below for a miscellaneous section after the fact, if we happen to have time, who knows? We're already running in the 45 minutes here almost. Uh, there may be a section after this that might be safe to go to, but otherwise, from this point on, for the time being, we're going to discuss spoilers for the Edan trilogy. Now
Right.
that everybody should have had a couple seconds to click away, I want to talk about the characters and their origins specifically, where I'm going to bring up just the three first and foremost: Dayraven, Sequara, and Saren. I want to know where these three came from, because I was very connected to each of these three characters in each of the three books, respectively, being my favorite part of them. Dayraven in Way of Edan, Sequara in Prophet of Edan, and Saren in Return to Edan.
Good. Good. Yeah. So Dayraven, that's a name that I took from Beowulf, and it's a kind of throwaway name in Beowulf. There's this random warrior, Frankish warrior that Beowulf kills by crushing him to death, and that's it. He's like there for a couple of lines. He's part of Beowulf's illustrious career, just a almost just like a random victim of Beowulf's martial prowess. And I thought, what a waste of a good name, you know? So I thought to myself, I want to write a story about a guy named Dayraven because I just think that's a cool name. And of course, in Beowulf, it's Old English. It's Dayraven. So I
Right.
modernized it, and so yeah, I thought, well, what do I do with this chap? And I suppose in some ways he starts out as a lot of people are going to think, oh, typical fantasy hero, kind of farm boy, naive, who's, um, the arc will seem familiar, I'm sure,
Right.
in Dan. Um, I hope I give some surprises even as early as Prophet of Edan, but I think I'm doing something a bit different by Return to Edan for sure. But yeah, in terms of where he comes from, I did want to cover a kind of hero's journey with his character, and that being, in the broadest possible terms, the departure, which is where the hero leaves his kind of womb-like safe existence and is forced out into the wide world. So think Bilbo Baggins having to leave the Shire, being kicked out by Gandalf on an adventure. And then there's the transcendence is the middle stage, and these correspond for me to the three books. There's the departure in the Way of Edan. There's the transcendence, which happens when the protagonist has to, as the word would imply, become something larger than themselves, to transcend their own ego, to become more mature or more powerful or whatever it might be, and that changes the person. That completely changes the person, who they are, how they see the world, and in very important ways. And often enough in fantasy these days, that's where it ends. Where a lot of people have said, "Well, gee, Prophet of Edan feels like the end in a way," but there's another part of the hero's journey that you see a lot more often in much older stories, which is the return, and that is the third book, Return to Edan. And I don't think it's done very often or very thoroughly in modern fantasy, where you have what happens afterwards. I mean, here you have this hero who's given everything, to save the day. But what happens to the hero after that? And what about this world that's been ravaged by war? You don't just go back to normal life after all of that.
Yeah.
There is an aftermath that must be reckoned with. And I wanted to look at that. And that's what Return to Edan is me saying, yeah, but what about afterwards? What happens to the hero who's given everything? And what happens to this ravaged world and the people who inhabit it? What are the repercussions of what these epic events that were, that meant a lot of loss and a lot of sorrow? I just don't think people, as you often see in fantasy, can, after the big battle's done, just start waving flags and cheering. That's just not, that doesn't feel authentic to me.
Right. It
So
feels
I
it
wanted
feels
to look
almost a little
at,
wrong
yeah,
in a way.
yeah,
But this was
yeah,
something that and I've told you this a few times already, that I really appreciated about Return to Edan, even before I read it, having analyzed that the climax of Prophet of Edan is the climax that most people would think that's the end of the arc. A lot of people forget that there's a little bit of resolution that needs to happen. Something that I brought up in my Prophet to Edan review specifically was Scouring of the Shire in Lord of the
yep, yep,
Rings, which is personally my favorite chapter of the entire story because of
mm,
how poignant it is, pointing out that things are different. And of course, you get this a little bit as well with the remainder of that conclusion. Frodo can no longer stay in the Shire. He's different, the Shire's different, everything is different. You
right,
can't just return
that's
to
right,
that. And a lot of stories today, generally, not just a fantasy problem, but a lot of stories forget this remainder of the conclusion, this change that forces the return. And especially how the return isn't exactly a return to normalcy, it's a return
right,
to home in a new normal. Something that Return to Edan I felt like did rather brilliantly, specifically in the climactic scene. And we haven't talked about spoilers, like direct spoilers of most of the books, but the very final scene, final battle is right out at the borders of the Mark, where
yeah,
this story has not been since the first act of the first book when Dayraven is forced to leave. A part of his character's arc, but also the world as well, needs this conclusion to the Mark. I was very happy to see the characters come back here because, well, it didn't really get to see it for a long time, and I felt like it needed to be done. But I don't know how
Yeah, I
many other
felt that way
readers might
too.
have forgotten that.
Yeah, I felt that way too. It's very important. Yeah, return can mean so many things. It can mean coming back to where you started. And, Dayraven has his meeting with Ebba, for example, before that final battle, which I think brings home to him the importance of where he is and his relationship with it. It's not what it was before, but it's still a place of great importance to him. I was talking about Dayraven, and he meets with Ebba, and he has this whole moment where I feel like it's a little bit like, I don't know if a lot of people experience this when if they go off to college,
Hmm.
and they, what they learn, what they do, they mature as people, and then they come home and suddenly they feel, oh wow, I feel different about the way I relate to home. I still love my home. I still love where I grew up and the people. Um, but I'm not quite the same person now, and that can be a bit jarring at times.
Home
And with
feels
what
more like
all
a
this,
nostalgic place than it does
yes,
a
yes, it does.
rather
Yeah,
than a place from
yeah,
memory, if that makes sense. But of course, I
yeah.
can't fully relate because I actually haven't left home yet.
Uh-huh,
But I
yeah,
totally get what you mean too.
yeah. Yeah, I'm actually envious of people who stay in one place all their lives. I never got to do that. It's just something that I guess the grass is always greener on the other side, but
The cliche
but
saying
anyway,
that
yeah, so that
turns out being correct.
yes, it does. It really does. Yeah, in my experience. So yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your question or not, but I think that's where Day Raven's return is in part going back to the mark, but it also ultimately is where he ends up. He quite literally returns to Edan in that final battle,
Yeah.
where he makes a sacrifice in order to save Sequara, to save their daughter, to save his friends and the people of the Mark, who have had just recently turned him away, to put it mildly. So yeah,
Yeah, it was a very emotional final sequence for me. I was hoping you wouldn't do it, but I knew you had to. Of
yeah,
course, that's how
yeah.
it goes when you're reading, when you can anticipate where something's going. I will say I'm glad Gnorn made it.
Good.
Because
Yeah.
if if he didn't make it, it would have been a little bit too familiar to that book right there, Kingdoms of Death by Christopher Rocchio, fourth book in Sun Eater.
Oh, I haven't read that yet, but I would love to. I plan to start Sun Eater myself this year, so
Yeah, I saw that in your reading plans video, and I'm like, yes, I
looking
don't have to
forward to it.
pester you about it in our discussion.
Yeah, no pestering needed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my favorite series, by the way, if that happens to help.
Oh,
One
absolutely. Every endorsement helps. Yeah.
Well, one other question I want to get into about characters specifically. What were your plans with POVs going into the trilogy, especially as it kind of evolved? Did you always want there to be a lot of them in the expanding cast as the trilogy went on, or did you originally want it to be rather limited, like book one mostly was?
Yeah, and I had a sense that I would be expanding things. I knew, and I'll try to answer this question along with the early one about Sequara and Sarah. I know I haven't talked about yet, but
Mm,
with I knew that Sequara was going to be another important character for me. In a way, I feel like she is a protagonist right there along with Dayraven. In some ways, she's the hero of the trilogy. You could say she saves the day in book one. She saves Dayraven, keeps him from dying, and in book two, she again saves the day because yes, Dayraven does control the dragon and defeats Bledla and all that, but then he is essentially taken over by the elf, and he's about to kill everyone. And if Sequara hadn't made it there in time, he would have. She pulls him back and reminds him of his humanity. So without Sequara, yeah, it would have been a very tragic ending there. And then finally, of course, she's the character we're with at the end of everything. We're with Sequara, and it's her perspective that we have at the very end. So I feel like she's she's just as important as Dayraven, and she's coming from a some, I think, important questions that I'm wrestling with through her character, such as the weight of duty, for example, and having to play a role that you never wanted to play necessarily, but she thought of herself as a healer always, but she is forced into this role where she has to become a killer. She has to, and there's that moment in Return to Edan when she goes back to Astrolad after what the Torlanders have done, and it was awful hard. It was hard for me to write those bits,
It was pretty brutal.
and pretty brutal.
And
Yeah,
you explore
and
that with her thoughts as well, and it wasn't even just the generic, oh, like, am I evil now? It was especially poignant to me a scene later when they return to Adanon, and she is talking with the Torland soldiers, and they're, you
yeah,
know, making way for her to return to Torlon, or to Torhelm itself. That scene
yeah,
specifically, like, was a gut punch, because you see her thoughts not just on what she did, as had been the case prior, but also specifically the humanization of the Torlon soldier, which she never
yeah.
allowed to happen in Astrolad. That was a very,
Yep.
very poignant scene. I loved that one a lot.
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, it's and she reflects on that and realizes, if I hadn't met this man who's standing here before me, whom I like, if I had met him in Ashdod, I would have incinerated him,
You'd be gone before I knew he
Um,
existed.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I'm trying to explore a lot through her, and I love her. I think she's one of my favorites, really. And then Saren just sort of, in the third book, I didn't realize how important she was going to be, but she just sort of took over the story in the best possible way.
The very first
Uh,
chapter, it was her, and that chapter, like,
yeah,
immediately brought me back to New Armalan. I was like, I love this thing. I don't know who this character is. We've just met her, but I love her.
yeah, she's a big part of me exploring the repercussions, because she goes through a lot, and Cargillion is where a lot of the worst things happen,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
so she's a means of exploring that, and at the same time, she's a vital part of the story. Her connection to Imhar being something that is a callback right to the beginning, where Dayraven had resolved at one point, we're going to find your sister, and as it turns out, they're too late to find Imhar's sister, but they're able to find her, Imhar's niece, at least. So yeah, I just felt like Saren tied so many things together, and I feel like she helped me to make Dayraven a better character too. And a lot of people have expressed that they didn't really care for Dayraven too much in the beginning, but by the end, they felt a much deeper sense of connection, and I think Saren might have helped with that.
I would
But
agree with that as far as Return to Edan is concerned. A part of this is because Saren feels like a natural extension of Sequara, despite being completely
mm,
disconnected from Sequara until, like, the very last, like, scene,
yeah,
basically. They basically don't know each other, but she feels like a natural extension of Sequara, being she felt like the real saving grace of Return to Edan, doing a very
yeah,
similar thing for Dayraven as pulling him back to humanity as
yeah.
far as capable. Uh,
Yep.
and I really
And then
liked
doing that very brave and then doing that very brave thing of going into the dungeons through that little, narrow water course
what an
that,
unlikely turn of events.
yeah, yeah,
Which itself was a really cool scene, because I had no idea why you were so homed in on Bagzak as a character in Return
oh,
to Edan. It
yeah,
felt kind of irrelevant, unimportant, even at, like, especially after the gift was taken from him uh
yeah,
by the Supreme Priest, or I forget the actual term, but then it all
Supreme
made
Priest
sense.
Tormund.
Once it did make sense, it was like, yes, that was a eureka kind of moment for me. But
Yeah.
Saren
Yeah, I'm glad old
specifically,
Bagsack got to play a role there at the end, yeah.
yeah, especially after that first book, because he was a mean one in
Yeah,
the first book. He was kind of the first,
yeah.
like, touch of ugly you really got to see in the series.
True. Yeah, and I feel like I hope that I created a sense of understanding of where he was coming from, maybe to some extent. And obviously, I think you feel a little bad for him because of what was done to him. And he's somebody who is, this is never an excuse, but the old, oh, I was just following orders, thing. But at the same time, I feel like he's somebody who had suffered himself plenty in his life, and that creates understanding, I think. So
This was also another thing that I talked about a lot in my various reviews, and that I will be bringing up in my video review for Return here when I record it. I was going to record that this morning, but then I didn't have time. Uh,
yeah,
is that everybody, and not just every like named character, but every nation as well, with Dayraven being really the only real exception to me. Basically everyone and every nation is both the good guy and the bad guy, depending on who you ask, and not just based off of their rivalries, but also based off of the outside parties as well. This was one of the most
yeah,
impactful parts of switching between so many POVs at different points, and especially in Prophet of Edan, where the battle sequences were concerned, where you would frequently, like once a page, basically flip back and forth between 2 or 3 different
yeah,
warriors in this battle on different sides. You would get this connection to a character and be like, I understand what he's doing, understand what he stands for. You go to the other side and be like, I was just rooting for that guy. And then you
right,
question it, but then you're also like, but I still do. And I felt that with basically everyone, even between Adnan and Cargillion, as
yeah,
nations. Both of them are very not good to each other, but neither of them are
yeah,
inherently evil as nations either. One of the
right,
great developments that you did through the series was being able to keep that across with every nation, even Torland to an extent, where a
yeah,
lot of it was driven by evil with Irkonwald as the king,
yeah,
but there were still good people there. This is, of course, how
yeah,
Dayraven and Imhar get their entire start on the journey, really, is being
yeah.
swallowed into the Endstone Mercenary Company,
That's
which
right.
is
Yeah, no,
Torland.
I tried even with a character like Bledla. To create a sense when you first meet Bledla, you're like, oh, evil guy. Yes, okay, he's bad. But I tried in even as early as The Way of Adan to complicate him a little bit
Yeah.
and to portray that he really, really believes that what he's doing is not just the right thing, but that it is like a divinely ordained thing that
Yes.
it must
Yes.
happen. And that he is the one who has been asked to make it happen, and this is a sacrifice that he is making. He's doing things that are awful to him. He kills a guy by entering his mind and essentially exploding his brain, and he doesn't do that because he's sadistic. He does it in pursuit of doing what he believes his duty is, which is to establish the kingdom of Edan, the kingdom of the eternal. So I hope, at least from that perspective, you could see where he would think he's the good guy. You never think he's the good guy, but he thinks he is, and that's believable, I hope.
One of the scenes that I would say really accentuated this with Bloodless character was when he is whipping himself. And this is as early
Yes.
as in The Way of
Yeah.
Adan. Like, that scene is specifically is like, oh wow, you really see this guy's devotion. This guy isn't just pure evil. He's doing pure
Right.
evil in the name of what he assumes is not. And that goes more into the realm of what human nature is and how people perceive good versus evil,
Yeah.
because a wide variety
Yeah.
of people can see that very different. The line is drawn at very different places.
Yeah, I tried to do it, and that scene is crucial. And then there's a later one where me and Dayraven meet, and he doesn't just kill Dayraven. He's like, "Whoa, wait, what if I'm wrong? What if he is the prophet?" And he has all this doubt. I would say the character where I really though tried to create a sense that Torlanders are not evil was in Return to Aden with Edge, who becomes a protector, a father figure to Saren, and
And a guardian of sorts for
this.
Dayraven.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so he's a character that I like a lot, and I feel like, yeah, when you meet Edge, you can't think all Torlanders are evil, right? He has a bit of a crisis too going on though, because he knows very well that he's been part of something that is not good. He's struggling with that,
Right.
and meeting Dayraven really brings that to the fore. Because you can see even earlier, before Dayraven comes on the scene, that he is trying to do the right thing, and it's impossible when you're soldiering in the service of an unjust conqueror. You know, you end up having to do things that are going to bother your conscience. You know, so you can't just say, "Well, I'm following orders. I'm following orders. I'm following orders." You know, there's a point where you realize what we're doing is wrong.
Maybe the
Yeah,
orders shouldn't be the order. maybe maybe
yeah,
the problem is with who's giving those orders, you know. Sometimes you have to.
yeah, and that's a tough place for a soldier to be in. I think, that's a real world thing. You don't want to blame the soldiers for doing their duty, um, but at the same time, you also think, you know, you wish maybe that there could be more questioning. Is this the right thing? You can't. It's a place to be in. I have never been a soldier. You can't be a soldier and say, I'm not sure that order is good. I think maybe we should think about this. You can't do that. You have to just do your duty. And that's how soldiering works. I'm sure there are circumstances where it is right for a soldier to defy an order. But those are few, I would think.
And knowing when
So
that occurs as the soldier is probably harder than actually doing it when you've decided.
yeah,
It's more about the question, yeah. And as kind of you put it, there has to be more of that questioning. And that also
yeah,
kind of, comes around talking about Edge. That entire sequence there at the southern coast, basically, of Cargillion, where Dayraven is doing his ministering. This is a question that I really want to pick your brain at a little bit, and hopefully it doesn't get in too sensitive territory. Uh, I found Dayraven in this section to be specifically a very like Sermon on the Mount as Christ-like figure, and I
sure.
felt like it seemed to me like that was very intentional, but it also reminded me of how important of a theme religion and religious adherence,
Yes,
particularly amongst like fanatics, is. Because Bloodlove from the very first book, this was one of my main concerns with the first book was, okay, how is religion going to be explored because of Bloodlove? Is this just a religion bad type of story that everybody's done and not very successfully in most cases, or is there more nuance? Ultimately, there was a lot of nuance, but I liked the different dynamics you were able to create between Dayraven and also Bloodla and Jarlman, if that's how you pronounce his name. I apologize.
yeah,
As the supreme priests.
yeah. Yes, this is great. Yeah, no, I think when you look at the real world that we live in, and you look at any religion, you can see all kinds of beautiful, important things that religion has inspired. It is a source of love and connection, and that is a wonderful thing. At the same time, you can equally see many instances when religion has inspired hate and division, and has been used as a bludgeon by sometimes people who are cynical and are simply just using the religion in a way that is abusive. But sometimes it is coming from people who are true believers, who think that God is telling them to kill these other people over there because they don't believe the same thing that they do. You know, and so it's a strange thing that humanity does. We can create something that is capable of such good and such evil at the same time. It's crazy. So I feel like religion is a logical thing to explore in literature, because it is, I think, a realm where you really see humanity's sort of double nature, that we are capable of compassion and beauty and wonder and connection, and we are capable of doing the most horrible, atrocious things at the same time. And how is that? How can you have that all wrapped up in one creature? And in many ways, Dayraven's journey is a journey of questioning, are we redeemable? Are we worth having around in the world? And the elf has an answer. All
No.
this suffering, yeah, the
Yeah,
answer is no.
the
You know,
elf says no.
the elf says no. Dayraven's heroism lies in his insistence that the answer is yes, that we are capable of enough compassion and beauty and wonder that our individual existences are worth it. And that's the struggle, right? You know, and you could see where the elf is coming from, I think, just from a purely cold and logical perspective. If you were some otherworldly, ethereal, timeless creature looking in on this planet, and you saw what this planet state is, and you realize that where is all the suffering and the destruction and the evil in this world coming from? Well,
Other
a
people
lot of it's coming
usually.
from the people, you know, us. And you could easily come to a conclusion that the rest of the world would be better off without humanity, and all the suffering that it creates. But yeah, I feel like I personally am enough of I'm clinging to my optimism that we are a redeemable species, that we can. I believe that it will require us to transcend our tribal divisions. It will require us to see all of humanity as fundamentally and spiritually connected to us, and that we are all here together as one family. It will require us to transcend our boundaries and our borders. But if we can do that, I think that we could have a beautiful world to live in. You know, and I want to keep believing that we can do that. You know, in spite of our many failures to do so. So,
I would say I agree, and I especially appreciate the way you explored this in the series, as I've said before, but also in the way that you said, being a logical thing to explore in literature, because if you look at one thing that basically every human civilization has created in some sense, independently of each other without knowing each other exists, is some form of religion, and usually they are very similar to one another or evolutions of past iterations within culture. And if you just kind of refuse to explore that as humanity exists within a work of literature, then you're kind of chopping off a large part of what makes humanity humanity, in my opinion.
yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that, and I think we have. Oh yes, okay, yeah. I was just saying we do have a reluctance, I think, to engage with controversial topics, with things like religion and politics, and I get that. But I think that it is the job of literature to engage with the tough things. It is not the only job of literature. It can do so many other things. It can be just entertaining, and that's fine. You know, if somebody says, I don't want to think about politics or religion when I'm reading. I just want to relax and you know, fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think that one of the jobs of literature is to engage with the tough stuff, and to explore, you know, human experience and wrestle with it. And so I chose to try and do that in this trilogy, you know, and hopefully didn't bungle it too badly.
I
So
don't think you
yeah.
did, at least. And to kind of expand on what you were just saying as well, I was watching a video that just came out today on a channel. Is it? Oh man, I can't remember his name. He's Ben McAvoy, I believe, on YouTube. But he does a
Uh-huh.
lot of literary fiction work. He has a hardcore literature book club that he does on Patreon, uh, exploring and doing lecture series on all of these classic books for all intents and purposes. Video that he actually just released today was how to read East of Eden, because for the book club they're reading East of Eden in the first quarter of this year. And one of the things that he brought up in that video was a quote that Steinbeck said kind of along these lines, just how human nature fits in with religion and our ideas, and how as an author you don't just have the right, but you almost have a duty to explore those ideas, because ultimately literature is humanity, and we see ourselves in literature, we put ourselves into literature. So as an author, you have to explore that, is to explore yourself, and readers should be able to do that for a similar purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is a very important job of literature. Yeah, for sure. I wouldn't say it's a necessarily an obligation for every writer to go there, but it is an important function. Yeah. So
I have a couple video ideas actually that I want to do at some point. Don't know if they'll be this year. They probably will be. They're kind of a two-part series, just to be in discussion with each other. Essentially, one of them is why literary fiction matters in a world where genre fiction is very popular today. Uh, and then also a counterpart to that of why genre fiction matters, why sometimes it's okay to just be entertained sometimes or have something that's a little bit simpler to convey those ideas when
yeah.
somebody isn't interested in, or in some cases just is not capable or don't feel themselves capable of reading some of the more difficult stuff. Why both of these
Sure.
matter, because I have friends on both sides of the scale. Some people who will not touch a classic to save their life because they think it's all pretentious nonsense, and then other people
Uh-huh.
who won't touch genre fiction because they think enjoying something for the sake of enjoying something is wrong. So it's kind of an interesting
And why
dynamic
can't
as
we
well.
have both?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
why can't we have both? You
yes.
know.
Why can't we have both? Um, but speaking of literature a little bit more broadly, do you have much more time to spend with the discussion today?
We can go a little longer. Yeah.
Okay, because I have a couple other questions that I kind of wanted to ask outside of the realm of Edan, but you can bring up your experience with Edan or however you see fit, especially regarding the fact that I found on uh, one of one website, I believe it's actually for the place you work, of some of your background. One of these
Uh-huh.
quotes, let's see, a quote that you made about Beowulf as a favorite book. I
Ah.
will just go ahead and read the quote as it was on the website. It says, Beowulf is ultimately a lament for the past. It's about how the things that are so precious to us in the present moment won't always be around, the people we are with, and the things we surround ourselves with. There is a kind of impermanence to life, which is what makes it precious. We briefly discussed your teaching. What made this teaching and reading and literature, what made it an important part of your life even before you decided to start writing?
Wow. You mean Beowulf specifically,
It can
or?
be anything, any of your favorite books, but this just happened to be a quote that about Beowulf.
Yeah, no, I believe that, and this is true of Beowulf, but also true, I think, of the works of literature that tend to resonate with me. They do speak to human experience. I teach a course called English Classics, which sounds a little bit intimidating, maybe, but it's simply old literature. I'm a medievalist, but this course is a survey course that covers medieval and Renaissance literature. But what I'm interested in, one of the things I'm interested in is what makes a classic a classic. Why is it a classic? Who decides that it's a classic? And my personal, preferred definition is that it a classic is a work of literature that somebody said, I can't remember who, it hasn't finished saying what it has to say to us,
Mm,
something along those lines.
something that
Or it
stands
is
the test of
simply,
time because of how it speaks to
yeah, that
us.
that sort of thing. I mean, yeah, there are human experiences that people 1,000 years ago went through, and we're still going through now. One of the obvious ones being, we're wrestling with our mortality. What happens to us when we die? What is the best response to our mortality? And this question is not going to get old. This is something that we all have to wrestle with on an individual and on a large cultural level as well. So classics are works of literature that still have something to say to us, and we can engage with them and feel a sense of connection with those people from 1,000 years ago, from 2000. You can read Gilgamesh, and they were talking about mortality in that, the oldest story known to humanity, right? Gilgamesh is trying to figure out, hey, how can I beat this mortality thing? She goes all the way to Utnapishtim, who is basically the Sumerian version of Noah,
Right.
and asks him, and Utnapishtim says, "Yeah, well, there's this one plant you can eat it and you'll be immortal, and you're meant to die. You know, that's just part of our of human nature, as part of our experience." So yeah, I feel like um, things like Beowulf, they're wrestling with questions that we are still wrestling with, and somehow experiencing other people wrestling with these things is helpful. Somehow it's cathartic. Somehow it helps us with our own understanding,
Sometimes
and
it's
that's vital.
encouraging in our own struggle.
Yeah,
This was
yeah,
something that I found to be the case in Les Mis when I read that last year. I found Jean Valjean to be
sure.
an infinitely relatable character, even beyond my own experience. Since now we've discussed both those classes that you teach between fantasy and English classics, what are some of your favorite books to teach, and what books do your classes, your students, tend to connect with the most year upon year? That's something that I'm really interested to hear.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fantasy course, I've had very large success with quite a few uh, titles, all the way from The Hobbit to Ursula Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea to George Martin's A Game of Thrones to Patrick Rothfuss's The Name of the Wind to N.K. Jemisin's fifth season. There's people like Harry Potter, and Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is one that has gone over well. There's just so many. Steven Erickson's The Gardens of the Moon. That I once did a semester where I made it a themed thing, and I was looking at imperialism as portrayed in fantasy,
That
and
sounds
I
really interesting,
used
actually.
yeah, it works great. I mean, you can do that. You can select readings based on a certain theme, and that worked out great. I used N.K. Jemisin's fifth season, R.F. Kuang's Poppy War, and Steven Erickson's Gardens of the Moon, and a couple others, and they worked really brilliantly. So yeah, I mean, it works well to explore some very important themes, and yeah, those they've all resonated really well. Sometimes students struggle a little more with the older stuff, but I think the struggle can also produce a lot of appreciation. So in terms of the classics, Beowulf is my favorite thing to teach, but I also do love teaching other shorter Old English poems like The Wanderer and The Wife's Lament and others. And I love the Old Norse material. I don't get to teach it as often, but things like the Eddas and the sagas and all that good stuff. And of course, there's some great Middle English literature too. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight probably is my favorite work of Middle English literature.
Mm.
Um, I do like the Arthurian stuff as well. It has a lot of myth rolled up into it, which appeals to me. But I do enjoy Chaucer's humor and the Canterbury Tales and that sort of thing. One work of literature that might surprise you to hear that really seems to go really well, at least it's conducive to a lot of conversation, is Milton's Paradise Lost. I
That
teach that in
doesn't
English
surprise
class.
me, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Knowing the discussion, one of my brothers actually did a lot of like analysis on Paradise Lost, was watching a lot of other people's like deep critical analytical analysis of not just Paradise Lost but also Paradise Regained. Is that the sequel? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
And was also
Yeah.
discussing a lot of that stuff with my family one night, and just knowing the general, you know, interpretations of the poem, even though I have not read it yet, um, makes it understandable that there's a lot of in,
Yeah.
a lot of discussion
Well, I
there.
can see we both have on our shelves behind us some John Gwynne there, Faithful and the
Yep,
Fallen.
I do have it behind
Paradise
me.
Paradise Lost is very important for understanding the faithful and the fallen. So um, yeah, it's a pretty vital influence for John Gwynne there. Yeah.
Maybe I'll have to look into that with a new lens when I continue with Valor at some point, because I actually have not continued that series yet. And I famously was very, very mixed
Oh,
on
okay.
Malice was. Yeah, I was like, there's a lot of potential here, but
Okay.
I did not connect with a lot of it. But I do plan to continue the series. But knowing there's something there, I might continue it with a different eye. That's all.
Yeah.
That's always a good way to go back into something, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that the Paradise Lost connection really does add a dimension to the reading of Faithful and the Fallen. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I've
But yeah, I mean,
always.
there are lots of. Oh, sorry. Go
You
ahead.
can continue answering. Yeah, I wasn't sure you had more to say.
Oh no, I was just finishing up really. Yeah, a lot of the stuff that I teach, and I do teach intro to literature as well. We cover short stories and poetry and drama, and that tends to be more modern stuff. So I get to be exposed to lots of much more modern storytellers, and I enjoy that a lot. I love. I actually can say there are moments in my own writing that are inspired by writers like James Baldwin, for example,
Hmm.
who's a 20th century American writer, and that's cool too. I enjoy various people's experiences and takes on life that have in little ways, informed little moments of my own writing. Maybe even some that I'm not aware of that are unconscious. So yeah.
That's very cool to hear. I've always said that I would never go back to school. Now that I got my associate's degree, I don't intend to do more schooling in my life, but I feel like it would have been slightly more bearable if I had a fantasy or classics classes to go into, especially since I started getting back into reading in late 2021, as I still had, a year and a half left of my schooling to do. So
Yeah.
it would,
Well, if
it
you
would have
ever
been cool.
do, yeah, if you ever do, I wish you the best with it. I think you can learn a whole lot on your own. You can pursue your own education. The nice thing about a more formal setting in a college is that there are some people who've blazed the trail. They've gone, they've mastered their disciplines, and they can say, yeah, here are the places you can go, and if you're motivated to do that, they can just kind of point you in the right direction, and off you go. But I know lots of people who never went to college and are brilliant and have educated themselves. And I had a blast. I loved college. I loved graduate school. I loved just immersing myself in learning. But there's lots of ways to do that. You don't have to do it on the formal level either. So
Right.
yeah,
That's one of the things that I've appreciated about starting booktube as well. So I've gotten connected not just with other readers, people who I've developed friendships with. Some of my closest friends now are a couple, fellow readers, just of random stuff, where you can have very deep and important discussions about anything that you've read without having to be an actual expert on it, like say a professor in a lot of cases might be. And
yeah,
that's one of the things I've appreciated. Plus, you have people like you who happen to also do booktube who I can talk to without being part of a
yeah.
class, which I
Yeah, it's great.
appreciate.
No, I'll tell you, I mean, I love teaching. I love my students. But there's one thing that I love more about BookTube, and that's everybody who's here is here because they want to be here.
Yes, yes. And
And
that's not
it's
always the
like we're
case with
all.
school.
No, I mean, let's be honest. A lot of people who are taking Intro to Lit are there because they have to get this requirement over with.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're a captive audience of a sort. Whereas if you're on BookTube, hey, you came in here on your own. You must love this to some degree. So
Right,
yeah,
right. On that note, I want to explore at least a couple of the maybe books or series that we have some reading overlap in, because I know there are a couple things. But maybe at some point in time, if we ever wanted to discuss some things once in a while when possible. I know we've both read Dark Tower. I invited you to
yes,
talk about that a little over a
yeah,
year ago now. I think it was like November or December 2022, and I was
yeah.
like, "Oh, if you want to discuss this, you're totally free." But you obviously had a lot on your plate. Um,
I did at the time, unfortunately, but
yeah, and
yeah.
that's
Great series though. I love it. It's weird and just Stephen King goes for it, and I'm absolutely here for that. Yeah.
yeah, I really enjoyed it. Last book, I have the rather unpopular opinion of it being my favorite in the series.
Same here.
Hey,
Same
yeah.
here. So we're in the same boat there. The Dark Tower, the book, is my favorite of the seven.
Yeah, it
Uh,
was fantastic. Although we do disagree a little bit on Song of Susanna, that was your favorite before
yeah,
Dark Tower was, because that
I
is
loved it.
that's easily my
I
least
love
favorite of
Song.
the series.
Yeah, I think Song of Susanna is, it's probably safe to say, the least popular of the seven
Yeah, I would
books.
agree. Well, Went Through the Keyhole and Gunslinger also have a little bit more mixed reception, but I think Song of
That is
Susanna gets the
true.
most actively negative, at
Yeah,
least from what
the
I've
most
seen, because not everybody reads Went
viscerally.
Through the Keyhole as well. It's not quite
Yeah,
as widely read where Dark Tower is concerned.
yeah, and I don't. Well, I think if you're reading Wind Through the Keyhole on a level of like Folk Tale, you'll get a lot out of it. If
Yeah,
you're expecting it to be like the rest of the series, then maybe I could see where you wouldn't be happy. But I loved Wind Through the Keyhole. I thought it was brilliant.
I did
So
too. Yeah, yeah. I loved not just the flashback portions, which delved the most into the horror that the series delves into is in
uh,
Went Through the Keyhole,
yeah,
but also the story told within that flashback I thought was really cool as well. I
it's
thought
beautiful.
I
Yeah,
think it's underrated as a book. And
yeah,
that story within the story as well has a lot of lore implications for the world that in some cases don't really become too apparent until actually the later couple books, which I
yep,
found to
yep,
be really
yep,
cool. Um,
yep. Totally agree.
obvious, Obviously, I'm also currently reading Wheel of Time and Faithful and the Fallen. So those are
Yep.
some things that someday I'll be able to talk more about at some point. I have a series on my channel. You might have seen it at some point, Wheel of Time Diaries, where I kind of been doing like basically just spoiler dumping and sort of my thoughts on the books as I've been reading them, which I
Yeah.
found to be fun. So, there, I was thinking I might end up doing something similar with Malazan when I eventually get to that, because I know that will be one I want to unpack a lot. But I figured
Yeah.
that would also be one that you might be interested in doing more
For sure.
content on, because it's your favorite,
Yeah.
isn't it?
It is, yeah. The Malazan series in general, including Malazan Book of the Fallen, but also the other series within the Malazan universe by Erickson and Ian Esselmont. Put it all together, and I think you have the most. I don't think it gets any deeper or vaster than what those two have accomplished in creating that world. You got almost 30 books now in that world.
Yeah, it's big.
Yeah, it's
uh,
big, and
Especially
it's
even just when you look at what Erickson alone has written, regardless of
for
Esselmont, like not just the 10 tomes that you have, because I have them stacked
yeah,
over here, but also in Carcanis and all the novellas as well, because I managed to get all those
yeah.
from that Humble Bundle deal that was going on a few months back.
Oh yeah, cool.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
decided to pick those up. I was just like, you know what? Why not? I can get the rest of these for cheap. Sure, let's do it.
yeah,
But
yeah. Why
I
not?
figured that if I eventually read that series, I would prefer to do it in a setting more conducive to being open about trying to analyze it and not understanding. Because when I do these Wheel of Time diaries, at least I'm kind of talking to a camera, and then some of the more discussion element of that is in the comments or with other people on Discord.
Yeah,
And I figured I wouldn't do once a week with those because I'm far too, slow reader to be able to do something like that with Malice on. But I figured if I started that maybe once a month or something, I could do a discussion with somebody or be able to do a little bit of a longer, more in depth analysis, trying to get something out of it. Because I do, for some reason, just really want to read it, even though I'm intimidated by it.
oh, yeah. I guess a lot of people feel that way, but it is a series that um, just kind of throws you into the middle of things right from the get go, and I feel like being okay with that is probably important. Being okay with being a bit uncomfortable at times, and not knowing exactly, not being the master of the story, and kind of going along with the story is, I guess, the best way to try to approach that. But that's easier said than done for many people, including myself. The
Yeah,
first
of
time I read
course.
it,
Yeah.
I kept going back to the character list and the maps and everything. I was like, wait, no, this. And then I wish I had somebody just sort of said, relax, just enjoy the where you are, and things will actually make more sense later on, and you'll be okay. But I figured it out enough, and then I was fortunate enough to do the reread with AP, and to have those discussions with him. And I do think it's a series that is fun to do with other people and
Right,
discuss.
right.
So
That's part of the reason
yeah,
why I want to do it that way, because I'm actually very happy and excited to have that resource there. Uh,
yeah,
having two fairly knowledgeable individuals being able to, guide me through it. Even like Mike has said that he used those to make a little bit more sense of what he's reading. But that's one that I want to do in sometime in the future. Probably not for a while because it's going to take me a few more years to even finish Wheel of Time.
yeah, you got a few chunks to get through there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just a little bit. I've only read 4 of the books, which sounds really good until you realize there's 15 of them.
yeah, yeah. Oh, you're including the prequel too, then? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I will actually be doing Fires of Heaven and Lord of Chaos both next year, but because they're the really chunky ones, and I know I need to take those a little bit longer, I'm gonna be
Yeah.
doing those like really spread apart. I have, I think it's March through April penned in for Fires of Heaven, and then somewhere in the
Okay.
November December range again for Lord of Chaos, because I'm going to be doing Infinite Jest over next summer, and that's like the big read for next summer. So I don't want to be doing Wheel of Time at the same time. But I figured I could do New Spring in between them because that's one of the spots that people say New Spring's fine is after 5, and because that'd be like 6-month gap basically in between 5 and 6. So I'm like, I can do New Spring there, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
Being
Cool.
very conservative with my timing for the series.
That's wise, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm probably gonna do the same thing with other big series like Malazan.
Yeah. Nothing wrong with that. The important thing is that you're enjoying the experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I figure if I give myself a little space with Wheel of Time, especially since Shadow Rising was actually unpopularly my least favorite of the first 4 so far, so I figure that
Oh,
giving myself a little space is probably better for the next couple books rather than plowing right on. Uh, Dragon Reborn was actually my favorite so far, which is also an
hmm.
unpopular opinion.
I like Dragon Reborn actually, but yeah.
But I mean,
I mean, it's been a while
right.
since I read them, but
I mean, for me, a lot of it, I actually mentioned this, I think, in my review for Return to Edan in the written one. I think, well, maybe it was just in my review for Shadow Rising. I don't remember. I talk a lot about climaxes and resolutions with reading. These are
uh-huh.
generally what makes or breaks something for me, which is a lot of why actually Wastelands and Song of Susanna are lower on the spectrum for Dark Tower, because famously the Wastelands ends right in the middle of the climax, which just
Oh yeah.
really irks me. And then Song of Susanna doesn't really have one. That climax is part 1 of book 7.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
so Dragon Reborn was basically the climax to the trilogy, and with some editing, Wheel of Time could have had just the trilogy out of those first 3 books. And I thought that Dragon Reborn culminated, like led towards that climactic scene brilliantly,
Sure.
as opposed to, say, Shadow Rising, which didn't actually lead into its climax, I thought, well enough, just for my
Uh,
liking, but also why
yeah.
Return to Edan worked for me so well.
Good.
Because you were
I'm
leading so
glad.
well into that after the full series.
Good. 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 Yeah.
But
Well, I'm very glad of that.
I don't have any more questions or anything like that for you, so unless there's something else you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, no, I just want to thank you. I really enjoyed this discussion a lot, and I'm very grateful to you for reading the Edan Trilogy. It's one of the most meaningful things you can experience as a writer, to have a perceptive and informed reader who resonates with the story. And you wrote some beautiful reviews on Goodreads,
There are some of
so
my favorites actually of the ones I've written.
yeah,
Especially Return to
yeah,
Edan. That review I did in basically first try.
yeah. That's an outstanding review. I mean, I just feel lucky to have a review like that. So, thank you.
Well, it was my pleasure to be able to read, and I also thank you for being willing to come onto the channel, especially in the middle, right after the holiday season, really. But it was really fun to be able to do this.
Great, great. I had a blast. So we'll do it again.
Yeah, maybe sometime in the future for some other series we're both interested in covering for something, or if I start Malazan sooner than I expect, or whatever happens.
Whatever.
Future is
Yeah.
always unpredictable.
Have you over on my channel. I'll find an excuse. So yeah.
Yeah, if
Um,
you want to have me over there, I'm totally game. Just, say the word.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. I've been calling you KC for King Crusoe. I hope you don't mind.
No, that's actually what most people call me, is KC. In fact, I find it a little bit.
Okay.
I find Casey a little bit more endearing than, say, like Crusoe, for example, like some
Uh,
people call me, just because Casey is also
yeah.
an actual name, Casey, which I didn't
Right.
realize until like 3 months after people had been calling it. So I was like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's actually a real name, isn't it? So, uh, whatever works. But
Cool.
it was nice getting to know you a little bit more.
Yeah. Likewise. Likewise. This was fun. Thank you.
I had a great time. Thank you for coming on the channel.
All right. And goodbye to all your viewers as well.
And that rounds up the discussion with Dr. Philip Chase, Dr. Fantasy, as he is known around these parts. Thank you for checking out this video, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion if you watched any portion of it, whether it was just the miscellaneous section or the spoiler-free section, or all of it if you happen to watch all of it. I did have a very wonderful time chatting with Philip. It was a great time to have him on the channel, and I hope to have him again sometime in the not too distant future, but who knows with the way that I read. But if you are here from Philip's channel, welcome. I hope you choose to stick around. I have quite the backlog of reviews and other book related material here that you can always check out in the meantime if you so happen to be interested. But once again, thank you to Philip for joining me and coming on the channel, and thank you for watching it. I'll be back in the next video on Thursday, wrapping up my 2023 reading tier list videos. That was a long one. There was a lot to discuss in that one. I went on a couple tangents and a couple points as well, but it was a generally fun time in that one. So I hope you check it out. I'll be back then.